This is the IBJ Podcast for the week of July 1st, 2024, brought to you by Taft. I'm Leslie Weidenbender, the editor of IBJ. We're giving Mason King a break this week and turning the podcast microphone over to IBJ arts reporter Dave Lindquist. His guest is our own Mickey Shuey, who, among other things, covers tourism and the business of sports for IBJ. That means he was all over the story last week that WWE would bring 3 of its top pro wrestling events to Indianapolis over the next 8 years. The agreement means Indianapolis will host WrestleMania, SummerSlam, and a Royal Rumble, all at Lucas Oil Stadium. Mickey and Dave get into the details during their conversation, and so I'll let them take it away.
I'm Indianapolis Business Journal reporter Dave Lindquist, and I'm happy to welcome to the IBJ Podcast my colleague Mickey Shuey, who writes about real estate, tourism, and sports business for the IBJ. Our topic this week is pro wrestling, which is definitely a business, and let's say it's sports-ish. At the same time, here are the facts. World Wrestling Entertainment and the Indiana Sports Corp announced last week a deal to bring WrestleMania, Royal Rumble, and SummerSlam to Indianapolis over the next 8 years. Hello, Mickey.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you. Let's begin with an overview of these events. WrestleMania, Royal Rumble, and SummerSlam. Each of these is big enough to be scheduled at Lucas Oil Stadium?
Yeah, so they are each big enough. In fact, over the past few years, SummerSlam and WrestleMania in particular have grown in their prominence and their size. It's WWE's biggest event of the year. It's kind of where all their storylines from the preceding 12 months converge, basically where a world champion is named, and where a lot of the biggest fans want to be because that's kind of the epicenter of pro wrestling.
My personal era of paying close attention to pro wrestling was in the mid-1980s. I remember Hulk Hogan, Mr. T, Cyndi Lauper, Roddy Piper, the Iron Sheik, even Liberace being involved in the first WrestleMania at New York's Madison Square Garden. And it's still a spectacle.
Yeah, it still is. It still is. I mean, my era of wrestling was kind of late 90s, early 2000s. So I remember seeing Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson when he was in, and then I went on to see The Mummy and then The Scorpion King in theaters because I loved him much as a kid.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, WrestleMania has really, perhaps it's a little unfair to say, but it's almost carried WWE on its back for a lot of years, especially for kind of these ancillary fans who don't know a lot about wrestling. It's kind of their gateway in. When they hear people talk about WrestleMania, it kind of perks up the ears and makes them think, maybe this is something I should get into. And then, yeah, the other events that we'll talk about, the weekly shows that are kind of that gateway in to actually them watching wrestling.
All right, I'll go back to the late 90s. I used to have some facial hair. My facial hair was influenced by a baseball player, Lance Johnson, on the Chicago White Sox. But because of my look in the late 90s, I would often have kids come up to me and go, they'd be like, Stone Cold Steve Austin or Goldberg. And I looked up who those guys were, and then I was like, okay, all right. No real threat of me putting a suplex on anybody. But, okay, so Madison Square Garden is a basketball arena. I don't know, it probably caps out at like 25,000 maybe. Mm-hmm. WrestleMania is 2 nights in a stadium.
Yeah. It started, as you said, in Madison Square Garden, and it's grown exponentially from there. I mean, even back when it was one night, when it was held here in Indianapolis the first time in '92, I think that was WrestleMania 7 or 8. That brought 62,000 people, and now it's double that. I mean, last year in Philadelphia, Lincoln Financial Field, they had 2 nights of over 65,000 people. Wow. So it continues to grow and is certainly continues to hold that title of biggest wrestling event.
All right, so specifically, why is the deal between the WWE and Indiana Sports Corp historic?
Well, it's historic really for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, this is the first time WWE has struck a deal with a local sports commission in the Indiana Sports Corp. It was the first sports commission in the country back in 1979 and was established to bring in these and other like sports or sports adjacent events to Indianapolis and central Indiana. But more importantly, it's bringing 3 huge events here. As we already discussed, WrestleMania is one of those, but then you've got SummerSlam, which is an event, as the name indicates, that's held in the summer. It's essentially the second biggest event of the year. And then you've got Royal Rumble, which is held late January, early February, and it's the third or fourth biggest, and that's never been here in Indianapolis. And this is the first time that Indy has had commitments for those 3 essentially in succession, and the first time that WWE has been willing to work with a local entity to ensure that there's longer than essentially a one-event partnership. Typically, they're a lot shorter-term deals.
First up for Indianapolis is Royal Rumble?
Yes.
And when is that?
February 1st of 2025.
All right, so that'll be like right before Super Bowl season.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, it's
is it the week?
Away.
Is that the week typically between the championship NFL games and Super Bowl?
Yeah, so I actually talked to Eric Newberger, who is the director of Lucas Oil Stadium, about this very topic because I was a little curious. Why is Indy able to host the event that week since the Colts have precedent and have rights to the stadium during football season? And he pointed out, just like you did, that that's actually the week between the AFC Championship game and the Super Bowl. So even if the Colts have a miracle run this year with Anthony Richardson, he said there's no reason to worry about there being a double booking because the Colts season would essentially be over at that point for the purposes of usage of Lucas Oil Stadium.
All right. And the dates for the other 2 are TBA?
Correct. They're both to be determined, and with both, there's a lot of finagling that's going to have to happen for the Indy sports calendar, since it is so busy, both in April when WrestleMania typically happens, especially in 2026. So, I mean, theoretically it could happen in 2026, but we do have the Final Four that year. And then we've got the women's Final Four in 28 and the men's Final Four again in 29. So WrestleMania is kind of a question mark at this point, but then SummerSlam is held usually, I believe, late July, early August time frame. That one may be a little bit easier to find a date for once the dust settles on Royal Rumble. I don't think that we're going to find out about those until Royal Rumble is either much closer or over.
All right. Yeah, SummerSlam will be competing with the Fever.
Yes.
Let's take a break to hear from our sponsor. You're listening to the IBJ Podcast.
Taft, today's modern law firm. With more than 800 attorneys in 8 primary Midwest markets and the District of Columbia, we provide solutions to the business issues facing middle market and emerging companies alike. We do this through a highly collaborative and inclusive team approach. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
Welcome back to the IBJ Podcast. This week, IBJ reporters Dave Lindquist and Mickey Shuey are discussing WWE's announcement that it will bring 3 of its marquee events to Indianapolis over the next 8 years.
It's not every day that Indianapolis and Saudi Arabia are mentioned together.
Yeah, that is a first, at least in my experience, and that's because Saudi Arabia has a deal with WWE to host some of its premium events, although it has not yet secured a WrestleMania or SummerSlam. But there are folks such as John Cena who have been pushing for WWE to become a more international fronting business. So they hope that he and others hope that maybe Saudi Arabia or other countries might get in on the action here in the next, let's say, 5 years.
Well, from our perspective, take that, Nashville and Columbus, Ohio, and dare I say Chicago.
Although it is worth noting that Nashville has said that it will probably have WrestleMania in 27 because of its new stadium that it's building. So there is a good chance that it'll get WrestleMania before we get it back, but we did have it first.
Exactly. Now, you wrote about how the deal came together for the June 28th edition of the IBJ. Could you tell us about Nick Khan and Patrick Talty and how their histories played into this?
Sure. So Nick Khan is the president of WWE, and Patrick Talty, the president of the Indiana Sports Corp, was at one time a lieutenant within the WWE family. He was essentially senior director of live events, and if that term sounds vaguely reticent in any way, that's because live events are what WWE does, such as the big events like SummerSlam, Royal Rumble, and WrestleMania. So Patrick had a lot of involvement in bringing those events to life, finding partnership opportunities with cities and with sponsors to make those events happen, along with your Monday Night Raw, your SmackDowns, all that. But yeah, I mean, like they've had a relationship for several years, and they both really credited the other with helping this deal come together because Nick knew and appreciated what Indianapolis was all about in terms of sports and sports adjacent entertainment, and Patrick understands the value that WWE places on making sure that its stars, its performers feel like kind of the biggest thing in the city, and I mean certainly helping Indianapolis do what it arguably does among the best in the world, which is host these live events. So it's kind of a meshing there in their minds of these two parties who have this mutual admiration and respect for each other, kind of coming together like we know what the other is about, so let's do something together.
Is it accurate that Nick Khan had a good experience at the college football championship game, and that had something to do with this?
Yeah, so while Indianapolis has kind of been courting WWE on and off for several years, I mean, they went after WrestleMania, or they considered going after WrestleMania in 2018, ultimately kind of pulled back on that and didn't pursue it, and that would have actually been for 23, the year that Philadelphia hosted. The big turning point in all this, it seems, came when Nick Khan attended the college football playoff national championship between Georgia and Alabama. He sat in the box with some ESPN folks, had a great time, and he went back to WWE's offices in Connecticut and said, guys, Indy's doing great stuff. We need to have some of our events there, and trying to find a way to build a relationship there. So yeah, that's kind of what kicked it off. And then from there, of course, conversations started, and they kind of went on as they do for quite a while before Indy was invited out to attend Royal Rumble in 2023, about 12 months later. And they at that point started talking seriously about not just Royal Rumble, but what would it look like for Indy to maybe host SummerSlam, to host WrestleMania again. So I think it's fair to say that while some local fans might not be big on Georgia and Alabama's football teams, they certainly played a big role in helping Indy get this win.
You just never know. My favorite bit of trivia is that Nick Khan's boss is Ari Emanuel. Like, Ari is the CEO of, what's the company called? TKO?
TKO, yeah. And
Ari was the inspiration for the super agent Ari on the show Entourage.
I didn't know that.
Yes. Well, the downtown proximity of venues and amenities is a winner for Indianapolis again and again when big events come to town. Is that part of the story again? Is that just a gift that keeps giving?
Yeah, I think it certainly plays a role in this and pretty much any deal that Indianapolis is able to secure. But when you look at an event like WWE's WrestleMania in particular, they want to have that connectivity to not just other venues, but to fans. They want to have spaces where fans can gather, much like what we saw with the All-Star Game earlier this year, and perhaps most notably the Super Bowl back in 2012. There's really a focus on creating experience around these big events. I believe SummerSlam may have something slightly smaller in terms of fan engagement experiences for its events, but I think WWE probably knows that Indy understands the importance of bringing people to the table, bringing people the opportunity to engage and interface with these wrestling stars, with those who are already well acquainted with the events that WrestleMania and SummerSlam are, and helping new fans, kind of ushering in that generation of new fans through direct contact with these superstars and athletes.
And fresh in my mind is the swim trials. I thought the fan aqua zone in the convention center and Georgia Street, that's some of the best activation I think we've had in a while.
Yeah, I heard a lot of really good feedback related to the aqua zone in particular. I mean, obviously a lot of hot days out on Georgia Street over the past week and a half, but still a lot of engagement. You had the Eiffel Tower out there. I mean, what city does that besides Indianapolis, really?
Right.
But I think we could see opportunities for more things like that with WWE, with its 3 top-tier events.
Well, just thinking of, I'm pretty sure that like podcasting is a cottage industry unto itself with pro wrestling, and there could be a podcasting row.
There could be. I mean, they have Radio Row for the Combine every year.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not just limited to the WWE universe either. I mean, there's AEW is an up-and-coming wrestling circuit. You've got kind of these more independent circuits that are happening, and they all kind of converge, even though they're not affiliated with WWE.
Right, it's an interesting piggyback.
Yeah, there probably will be events at facilities like Hinkle Fieldhouse or at Indiana Farmers Coliseum. I mean, we may even see stuff up in Noblesville at the new venue that they're building up there, or at the Fishers Event Center that's almost done. I mean, there's going to be a lot of wrestling going on in Indianapolis and central Indiana whenever WrestleMania comes here, and perhaps as well for Royal Rumble and SummerSlam.
Nice. Well, let's talk numbers. What's the projected economic impact of this deal?
So right now, for just those 3 events, the projected impact is about $350 million. Now, we don't have specifics for each of those events. I've requested that information from the Indiana Sports Corp, but I've not gotten that data as of recording. But according to studies that have been done in the past on the economic impact, and certainly some of our listeners might be thinking, well, economic impact, I mean, that's just a number that's kind of thrown out there. And there's a lot of skepticism surrounding those numbers. So acknowledging that off the bat, WWE, in the studies that it's had commissioned, has said that its WrestleMania event generates about $200 million per year for the host city. And that does take into account not just the WWE stuff, but also those other, as you use the term, cottage industry type things like wrestling and bringing podcasts from out of town, all that good stuff. So I think, and then you've also got typically there's a Monday Night Raw show, a SmackDown show related to WWE's WrestleMania that are held that same week. So there's a lot going on. So it could generate a lot of revenue for Indianapolis.
To prepare for this conversation, I fired up Peacock and watched an episode of Monday Night Raw from earlier this spring That show was made in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Gamebridge Fieldhouse here in Indianapolis just hosted one of these, right?
Yeah, on Monday.
And you were there.
I was.
What's the atmosphere?
Well, it's pretty intense. I mean, this was my first time at a live wrestling event. As I said, I was a big fan of wrestling when I was a kid, back when it was WWF. But first exposure to wrestling in 20 years, and it still felt as exciting as ever. I mean, you had people of all ages. I saw kids probably as young as 3 or 4, and I saw grown men and women, and then I saw grandparents and people probably in their 80s or even 90s. It was honestly kind of surprising to see that diverse of a crowd in terms of age at this sort of event. I mean, it really casts a very wide net. And in the performers, while they're not necessarily people that I'm familiar with, they seem to have a lot of buy-in from the crowd, just as they did back 20 years ago. And then you've also got the storylines, which, I mean, storylines in wrestling, you either love them or you hate them, I feel like. But the crowd that was there really seemed to enjoy itself, and they were getting into it. I mean, while Pat McAfee didn't end up being there, he's obviously a commentator for WWE. He has a Pat McAfee show based here in the Indianapolis area. Well, he wasn't there on Monday. Tyrese Halliburton with the Pacers, he had a ringside seat, and he had to hold the belt and engage with the crowd a little bit. So certainly still a lot of interesting atmosphere going on with even these smaller shows and events that are hosted at Gamebridge Fieldhouse.
I'm fascinated by the business model of making it a traveling road show on television. I remember back in the 80s, Ted Turner had a wrestling company that was a competitor of Vince McMahon, and Ted Turner's company was topped by Ric Flair. And those TV shows were made in a studio in Atlanta. There might have been 200 or 300 people in the audience. And, of course, the WWF was always pretty associated with the East Coast. Right here in Indianapolis in the 1960s, there was a guy named Dick the Bruiser who had a company that was very popular in the Midwest. But, of course, the story goes that Vince McMahon rolled up all the mom and pops from around the country and made this national scope. And another thing that hasn't changed in the last 40 years is the relentless promotion of future events. They're always talking about what's coming up. Do you have any thoughts on why that's an important part of the business model?
Well, I mean, when you're engaged in live entertainment, you always want to kind of leave people wanting more, right? So I guess the prevailing theory for that would be that as soon as this event's over, they don't want wrestling to leave the minds of the people who are just at their event or just watching the show. They want them to look forward to Royal Rumble or to next week's SmackDown. They want and that's how the storylines work too. I mean, they don't ever really finish the story. They just kind of keep leaving crumbs, right? So, I mean, it seems like it's a solid business strategy because it keeps people coming back, and it's effective.
It's very soap operatic.
It is. I mean, if you had told me that we would be sitting here today talking about how wrestling and soap operas are alike, I wouldn't have believed you, but you are right. I mean, they're very similar in that way, I think.
All right, so yeah, Pat McAfee was a commentator on that episode of Monday Night Raw that I watched. I mean, is it a stretch to think that his presence in Indianapolis and his presence in the company also might have something to do with this?
That I haven't really been able to get a good read on, because Pat is a very much larger-than-life individual at times, especially when it comes to the way his influence is perceived. That's not to say he doesn't have influence, because he does. But what it really comes down to in a situation like this is, can WWE make Indianapolis work from a financial standpoint?
Sure.
Can Indianapolis make WWE work from its financial standpoint? And what was the value there? And can the two parties find a way to come to a resolution that's going to be good for all involved? And while Pat may have kind of tried to catalyze this and cheered it on, I think at the end of the day it probably came down more to the folks in the suits and ties in the boardrooms of WWE and Indiana Sports Corp and Visit Indy making sure that Indianapolis could lock down a deal like this.
Recent figures show that World Wrestling Entertainment has a market cap of $8.37 billion. It seems on financial footing, and the company has survived the exit of former CEO Vince McMahon, who has been accused of sex trafficking and sexual assault. Is it a safe bet that this brand will continue to be popular for the next decade?
I think it is. Looking on Monday night, I mean, as I said, there's generations of fans that have been built up over the past 40, 50 years. I mean, yeah. I'm sure some of the fans who were in that room probably were at the shows in Indianapolis in the 1960s and 70s, and that's what got them into wrestling. I don't think that that's going away. It may change in how it looks. It may skew more toward like what's going to happen with AEW over the next 10, 15 years, what's going to happen with some of these other smaller circuits. I mean, are they going to get folded in? Are they going to dissipate? But I think at the end of the day, pro wrestling is going to continue to be an industry that people want to go see and people continue to talk about. I mean, we have a couple people in our office who love pro wrestling, and they have for years. People in my family who love wrestling. I'm sure people in your family who love it too. And while it's something that others around them just may not get, those who get it, get it.
Yeah. And I would say that the WWE/WWF has evolved with the times. Like, it's reflective of its era, and it's not afraid to try different things. Like the other night when I was watching that Monday Night Raw episode, instead of the host doing a staged or hype interview with the wrestler himself came out at the beginning of the show and he did a monologue for like 5 minutes and he was the host. So yeah, they're very good at presentation and communication, no doubt.
Well, and I think it's important to add to that Raw specifically will be moving to Netflix next year.
Is that right?
Yeah, and Triple H was on Pat McAfee's show earlier this week talking about the Indianapolis deal, and they got to talking about the whole move to Netflix, and he and Seth Rollins, who is another big wrestler now, they both are very up on that deal because it kind of lets WWE be WWE. It doesn't have the constraints of terrestrial television networks such as cursing and content that they're going to have to stick to. I mean, Netflix, the way Triple H described it, is going to be essentially a no-holds-barred sort of setup for them to do what they want to do. And while they've kind of stuck with the PG-13 aspect of it, and I think they still will for the most part, I mean, there's a reason that Rollins' name is Seth freaking Rollins.
Gotcha.
And that's because they want it to be more focused on being TV friendly right now.
Well, I think about when I started watching it, they would talk about the old days where they would bring metal devices into the ring and open up like a drape of blood coming off of someone's forehead. So maybe that's the future again. Now, there's a legacy project connected to this, which I have to say surprised me, but also seems like a very Indianapolis thing. What can you tell us about that?
So a lot of that is still evolving. The legacy project could be anything from extensive Make-A-Wish Foundation partnerships to engagement with students in schools to, I mean, like any number of things. I mean, if you look at what Indianapolis has done for previous events, I mean, there have been murals, there have been new basketball courts for the NBA All-Star. There have been scholarships that have been given out. So I think when we talk about legacy project, it'll probably be a multitude of smaller acts throughout either the lead up to Royal Rumble or WrestleMania or really all these events in tandem. But I think the focus is going to be on helping wrestlers and WWE kind of interface with the community, find those new fans that it seems very confident are here in Indianapolis. I mean, it's been here 100 times over the past 40 years.
Wow.
It keeps coming back, I think, because it knows that there's more fans to be had here. It knows that Indianapolis is a prime market for wrestling. I mean, the Midwest as a whole is a prime market for wrestling, but Indianapolis in particular seems to have an affinity for it, and I think they're going to try and pay that forward through engagement with local students and probably some not-for-profits like the Boys and Girls Clubs or Make-A-Wish.
Nice. Thank you, Mickey, for your time today.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Thanks again to Dave and Mickey. You can read more details about how the Indiana Sports Corp's deal with WWE came together in the latest issue of IBJ. Also in that issue, you can read about a new initiative called Indy Biz Pass that's meant to connect Black entrepreneurs to business resources. And Mickey has a second story, this one about how a proposed soccer stadium at what is now the downtown Indianapolis heliport could be a catalyst for growth on downtown's east side. You can read these stories and more at ibj.com. Thanks for joining us, and Mason King will be back next week.